I was looking at a map of the Eurasian continent recently, and something felt fundamentally missing. We are often taught that the great cradles of civilization, China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, were like these isolated islands, separated by impassable deserts and towering mountains, each developing their own grain and gods in total silence. But then I encountered the work of Kazuo Miyamoto. He doesn't look at history in terms of centuries. He looks at it in a sweeping arc of 2 million years. He pointed me toward a specific artifact, a delicate, three-legged bronze wine cup called a ju, unearthed from the Arlitu site, the place many believe was the capital of the legendary Xia dynasty. It is elegant, fragile, and designed for a sophisticated ritual involving music and alcohol. It suggests a society obsessed with order, ceremony, and staying put. This, he noted with a detached, scholarly calm, is only half the story. Because at the exact same moment this refined wine culture was emerging in the heart of China, something entirely different was happening just a few hundred miles to the north. Up in the vast, windswept grasslands, people weren't interested in delicate cups or ritual bells. They were forging practical, lethal bronze knives and axes. They weren't building walls, they were breeding horses. The standard narrative tells us that Chinese history is a straight line of farmers and dynasties. But Miyamoto describes a sudden prehistoric cold snap, a climate shift that turned fertile land into frozen plains, which forced a collision between these two worlds. It wasn't just a conflict, it was a transformation. This other China, the one on horseback, acted as a high-speed bridge carrying wheat from the Middle East and bronze technology from the West directly into the Yellow River Valley. It leaves you with a haunting question. If it weren't for this bridge of nomads that we so often dismiss as outsiders, would the Middle Kingdom have ever even begun? Or is what we call China actually the result of an ancient, violent chemical reaction between two civilizations that should never have met?
That image, the violent chemical reaction, it's really the only way to process the scale of what Miyamoto is talking about. It fundamentally breaks the model most of us learned in school.
It really does.
The sealed container theory of Chinese history. We tend to see the Great Wall and just assume that for 5,000 years, civilization was everything inside the wall.
And everything outside was just static.
Exactly. Barbarian static, totally irrelevant to the main story.
Right. It's usually framed as China versus the world, or at least China ignoring the world. But what Miyamoto seems to be saying, and it's a powerful idea, is that without that static outside, the signal inside never would have clarified. The chaos wasn't a distraction, it was a necessary ingredient.
It was a catalyst. And it's not just Miyamoto either. For today's deep dive, we're pulling from a whole stack of research economists like Ko, Koyama, and Song, who are looking at the what they call the institutional DNA of East Asia. And they all converge on this one point.
Yeah.
You cannot explain the modern Chinese state.
It's scale, it's speed.
Exactly. It's massive scale, it's obsession with stability, it's industrial speed. You can't explain that by looking at the farmers alone.
Yeah.
You have to look at the collision.
The collision between those two worlds, the two systems theory you mentioned.
Right. Think of it as two massive, distinct ecological engines. Engine one is the agrarian South, the Yellow River and Yangtze River basins. This is the land of wet mud, intense labor, and, well, staying put.
Deep roots.
Very deep roots. Then you have engine two, the nomadic North, the steppe, the land of wind, horses, mobility, and warfare.
And the argument is that China, as we know it, isn't engine one. It's the machine that was built to manage the friction between engine one and engine two.
Pretty. And to really understand that machine, to get why it looks so different from the machine built in Europe or the Middle East, we had to take it apart. We need to look at the gears, the mechanism.
We've got a roadmap. We've broken it down into 3 specific stories, or I guess mechanisms that act as the DNA for this civilization. First, we're going to talk about water, hydraulic bureaucracy, how the sheer physics of the river created the state.
The foundation of everything.
Then second, we're going on to the Steppe Highway. This is the tech story, how the nomads acted as an accelerator for ecology and agriculture.
A technology transfer like no other.
And third, we're tackling the Unification Impulse, the big question. Why does China always try to be one giant empire while Europe is, well, happy shattering into 30 different countries?
It's a powerful lineup. And you're right, we have to start with the water. Because before you have empires or bronze or horses, you have the mud. You simply cannot understand the psychology of the Chinese state without understanding the specific, terrifying physics of the Yellow River.
I've been diving into some historical archives lately, and it's fascinating how the echoes of 10,000 years ago still vibrate in the way a modern superpower functions today. When we talk about state capacity, we usually think of spreadsheets and infrastructure. But I heard a story once, a reconstruction of a life along the Yangtze during the dawn of the rice era that really puts a human face on it. Imagine a village elder, skin leathered by the sun, standing at the edge of a muddy embankment. It wasn't just about his family's survival, it was the realization that unless he coordinated with the village 5 miles upstream and the one 10 miles downstream to manage the seasonal floods, everyone's crop would rot. This wasn't a choice, it was a biological mandate for centralized logic. I look at this story and I see the institutional DNA being written in the mud. It makes me realize that what we often critique as rigid bureaucracy is, in this context, a 10-millennium-old survival reflex. It's the sheer weight of the river demanding a single unified command to keep the lights on, or in their case, the grain dry.
That term you used, biological mandate, that is the absolute key. In the West, we often think of big government or centralized bureaucracy as a political choice.
Right, it's an ideology, something you vote for or against.
Exactly, a philosophy you adopt. But looking at the Yellow River Basin, it just wasn't a choice. It was a geological hostage situation.
Okay, so let's get into that. You mentioned earlier that the Yellow River is often called the River of Sorrows. I want to dig into that because, all rivers flood, the Nile floods, the Mississippi floods. What is so specifically nasty about the Yellow River that it would warp the entire political structure of a civilization?
It comes down to one word, silt, or to be more specific, loess.
Loess. That's the yellow dust, right? The stuff that blows in from the Gobi Desert.
Well, not exactly the Gobi. It's from the Loess Plateau upstream. It's this incredibly fine, wind-blown soil. It's very fertile, which is great for farming, but it's also highly erodible. So when the rains come, the river doesn't just carry water, it carries a massive sludge of this mud.
A sludge.
The estimates are just mind-boggling. The Yellow River carries something like 1.6 billion tons of sediment a year.
1.6 billion tons. I can't even visualize that. What does that even look like?
Think of it less like a river and more like a moving slurry of wet concrete. That's the consistency we're talking about. Now here's the physics problem. When that fast-moving, muddy water hits the flat North China Plain, it slows down.
And all that stuff just drops.
It drops right out of the water and settles on the bottom of the riverbed.
So the riverbed gets shallower and shallower every year.
It rises. Year after year, it rises. So what do you do if you're living there? You build levees, earthen walls to keep the water in, but the silt keeps settling, raising the bed further. So you build the levees higher.
It's an arms race against the river itself.
An arms race that goes on for centuries until you have this phenomenon that hydroengineers call the suspended river.
A suspended river? What does that mean?
It means the bottom of the riverbed is actually higher than the surrounding fields.
Wait, say that again?
The river is flowing above the level of the land. If you were standing on the roof of a house in a village near the river, you might have to look up to see the boats sailing by.
So you're living underneath a giant, elevated aqueduct of mud that is just waiting to burst.
That wants to kill you. And this is where the politics comes in. If that levee breaks, it's not a little puddle in your basement. It's a catastrophe. The river spills out from the high ground and can wipe out thousands of square miles. It can kill millions of people. It literally creates a new inland sea overnight.
Okay, so if I'm that village elder standing in the mud, I start to realize that I can't just trust my cousin to patch up the wall. I can't just trust the village next door. Because if the village 10 miles upstream does a bad job,
you die.
I die.
And conversely, if the village 10 miles upstream builds their wall too strong and narrows the channel, the water speeds up, gains force, and bursts the wall at your village.
So everyone is inextricably linked by the hydrogeology. You can't opt out.
You cannot.
Ah.
Which brings us to Karl Wittfogel. Now, you sent me his work on Oriental despotism. I have to say, that title sounds incredibly dated and frankly a bit offensive to modern ears.
It's very much a product of the Cold War. But you're right, we have to strip away the political baggage of the title and look at the core thesis, which he called hydraulic society.
Right. And what Wittfogel did was compare this Eastern environment to the West, specifically Europe. In Europe, for the most part, you have rainfall agriculture.
Which is pretty self-explanatory. The rain falls, the crops grow.
If you're a farmer in medieval England or France, you plant your seeds and you wait for rain. You might dig a small ditch to drain a waterlogged field, but generally your operation is autonomous. You don't need the King of England to make it rain.
The king can tax you, sure. He can conscript you for a war, but he isn't technically necessary for the wheat to grow.
He is not fundamental to the means of production. So structurally, power can be decentralized. I can be a feudal lord, you can be a feudal lord, we can ignore each other, and the food still grows.
Right.
But in the Yellow River Basin, rainfall isn't enough, and the river is a monster. You need massive scale irrigation to grow the crops, and you need massive scale flood control to not die. No single family, no single village, not even a single city-state can manage a river that is thousands of miles long. It requires a massive coordinated effort.
You need a managerial class.
You need a bureaucracy. You need a central authority that can look at the whole system and say, okay, we are going to mobilize 100,000 men to dredge the riverbed in Sector 4, and we're going to build a spillway in Sector 7 to relieve pressure on Sector 8.
And that authority has to have absolute power, because if Sector 7 says, no thanks, we don't want to be the spillway, then Sector 8 drowns.
They drown. So the authoritarianism isn't just a preference. It's not, we like having a strong leader. It's, we need a conductor for the orchestra, or the music stops and we all starve.
It's baked into the geography.
And it leads to the creation of very specific institutions. Look at the Han Dynasty, for example. They established the Tu Shui, the Director of Water Conservancy. This wasn't some minor post. This was a cabinet-level position within the Ministry of Public Works. It was one of the most powerful jobs in the entire empire.
And how did they actually do the work? I mean, we talk about mobilizing labor, but this is pre-industrial. They didn't have bulldozers or excavators. They had wooden shovels and woven baskets.
They had corvée labor. And this is a concept we really need to wrap our heads around to grasp the institutional DNA of China. In the West, we think of taxes primarily as money. You pay the IRS, you pay VAT. In ancient China, the primary tax was your body.
The survival tax I mentioned?
Yes. Every able-bodied adult male owed the state a certain number of days or weeks of labor per year. Usually during the winter, which was the agricultural slack season, the state would issue a decree and hundreds of thousands of peasants would be marched to the river.
Let's just linger on that for a second. Imagine the conditions. It's January in North China. It's freezing cold. The wind is howling down from the steppe. You are standing in freezing mud, maybe waist deep, digging silt with a hand tool, carrying it in baskets up a slippery, icy embankment for weeks on end.
It was brutal. Absolutely brutal. Many died. You could argue it was essentially a form of temporary slavery, but, and this is the crucial but, the cultural understanding, the social contract, was that if we don't do this, the summer floods will kill our children.
So it creates a very different relationship between the citizen and the state. The state demands your labor, your body, but in exchange, it provides the most fundamental security of all, the security of the soil.
It validates the very existence of the superstate. The state is the only thing standing between you and a geological apocalypse.
And you see this tension playing out in the historical records. Linda Liang's research highlights something called bureaucratic myopia. This is the constant struggle where local officials try to game the system.
Right. They're only focused on their little stretch of the river.
It's the ultimate MVY problem. Not in my backyard.
Exactly. Don't flood my prefecture, build the levee higher here, and flood the next guy's prefecture downstream. This internal conflict, this local selfishness, actually forces the central government to become even stronger, even more intrusive, to override local interests for the greater good of the entire basin.
That feels incredibly modern. I mean, jump forward 2,000 years. Look at the South-North Water Diversion Project today. They are literally moving billions of cubic meters of water from the Yangtze Basin up to the arid north through massive concrete canals. Or the Three Gorges Dam.
It is the exact same logic. It's the same institutional muscle memory. The technology is upgraded from baskets to hydroelectric turbines, but the institutional DNA is identical. The state's legitimacy is derived in large part from its ability to tame the water.
But the problem has flipped, hasn't it?
It has. Liang points this out. Anciently, the priority was flood control, keeping the water away. Today, with industrialization and massive population growth, the priority has shifted to water scarcity, getting the water to the people.
So the problem inverted, but the solution remained the same.
The big red button on the desk of a central planner. Correct. Whether you are fighting a flood or fighting a drought, in this specific geography, the individual is helpless. Only the collective, organized by the state, can survive. That is the bedrock of the civilization.
Okay, so we've established the foundation, this institutional software. We have a society that is biologically wired to organize, to centralize, and to mobilize labor on a massive scale just to survive the mud. That explains the obsession with stability and order.
Right.
But a bunch of guys with wooden shovels doesn't explain the tech. It doesn't explain the chariots, the bronze weaponry, the sudden explosion of military power.
No, it doesn't. For that, you have to look away from the river. You have to look north. To the people who weren't stuck in the mud?
I saw a thread online recently discussing how we view innovation, and it reminded me of this vivid scene from the ancient northern frontier, where the green of the North China Plain meets the gold of the steppe. Try to imagine a settled blacksmith in a small agricultural outpost. He spent his whole life perfecting stone tools, maybe some simple pottery. But then he encounters a writer from the north, a nomad carrying a bronze blade forged with techniques carried across the Eurasian steppe from the distant west. There is no not invented here syndrome. There is only the frantic, brilliant hustle to deconstruct, adapt, and then scale that metal for the masses. I think about that blacksmith when I see reports on modern industrial output. The story of the Silk Road's precursor isn't just about trade, it's about the specific cultural resilience and assimilation. As a creator, I find it incredible, and perhaps a bit daunting, to realize that this industrial dominance isn't a 21st century fluke, but a deep-seated habit of absorbing the world's best ideas and turning them into a million physical realities overnight.
That encounter, the blacksmith and the writer, that is the perfect microcosm for our second story, the Steppe Highway. We tend to think of the Silk Road as, camels carrying spices and silk to Rome.
Right, around the time of the Han Dynasty or the Roman Empire.
But what we are talking about here is much older and much, much faster. We're not talking about camels. We're talking about horses. And we're talking about the Bronze Age.
Okay, so where do we start?
We have to start with the Cima Turbino phenomenon.
Cima Turbino. It sounds like a secret government project or something.
It's one of the most fascinating and, frankly, baffling mysteries in modern archaeology. Around 2100 BC, give or take a century, we see a sudden explosion of very specific, very high-tech artifacts appearing across a massive stretch of Eurasia.
How massive?
From Finland in the west all the way to Thailand in the east.
That is a huge geographic spread. And you're saying this wasn't an empire. It wasn't like the Romans conquering everyone and imposing their style.
No, it wasn't a state. It was a migration. A very rapid movement of mobile, metalworking warrior groups originating somewhere around the Altai Mountains, where Russia, China, and Mongolia meet. They moved across the steppe like a shockwave, and they carried a specific technology package.
Let's get technical for a second. When we say bronze technology, what does that actually mean? I think we take metal for granted today. Why was this such a game changer compared to what the Chinese farmers already had?
The farmers in the Yellow River Valley had stone, they had pottery, maybe some very, very primitive hammered copper, but the Cima Turbino groups had mastered lost wax casting.
Okay, unpack that for me. How does lost wax work?
It's ingenious. Imagine you want to make a complex shape, like a hollow spearhead with a little hook on the side. Carving that out of stone is a nightmare, maybe impossible. With lost wax, you sculpt the object out of beeswax first. It's soft, it's easy to shape, you can make it incredibly intricate. Then you cover that wax model in wet clay and bake it.
Ah, so the wax melts and drains away. Lost wax.
Exactly. And it leaves you with a perfect hollow negative of your object in the hard-fired clay. You pour in the molten bronze, let it cool, break the clay mold, and boom, you have a complex, durable, perfectly formed metal tool.
And what kinds of tools were they making?
Specifically, socketed spearheads, which are much stronger and more reliable than just tying a sharp stone to a stick, and these beautiful curved knives, often with intricate animal head handles.
So these guys come riding out of the steppe with weapons that are lighter, sharper, and stronger than anything the locals have ever seen. That must have been terrifying.
We can see the terror in the earliest written records. Decades, maybe a century later, the Shang Dynasty oracle bones, the first writing in China, are obsessed with a group they call the Gifan.
The Gifan.
It translates to something like the Devil's Country or the Demon Regions.
Subtle. They weren't fans.
They were scared of them. And for good reason. These were people who moved fast, struck hard, and had this alien technology. But here's the chemical reaction we talked about. The Chinese didn't just build a wall and hide, they engaged. They fought them, yes, for over a century. They traded with them. And most importantly, they learned from them.
They reverse engineered the alien tech.
Look at the tomb of Fu Hao. She was a Shang Dynasty queen and a general, a fascinating figure in her own right, one of the most powerful women of the ancient world. In her tomb, archaeologists found hundreds of bronze weapons and jade figurines. And when you look closely at the bronze knives,
Let me guess, animal heads.
deer head pommels, identical in design to the Cima Turbino Steppe art. The absolute elite of the Chinese state were adopting the aesthetic and the technology of the devil's country.
Okay, but this is the critical point, isn't it? The industrial assimilation theory. They didn't just copy it.
They didn't just copy it, they scaled it. This is the key. The nomads used bronze for practical, portable things. Knives, axes, horse bits, things you can carry in a saddlebag. But when that technology package hits the hydraulic bureaucracy, the society with the massive, organized labor force and centralized resource control, they go huge.
They stop making pocket knives and start making what?
Ritual vessels. Massive bronze cauldrons called Dane vessels. Some of these things weigh nearly 2,000 pounds. They are casting bronze on an industrial scale that the world had never seen before.
So the nomads provided the R&D, the know-how, the spark, but the agrarian state provided the fuel, the labor, and the resources to turn that spark into a bonfire.
Exactly. It's the factory of the world model, 3,000 years early. The genius wasn't necessarily in the initial invention, but in the scaling, the mass production, and the integration of that technology into a complex social hierarchy. Those big vessels weren't for fighting. They were for rituals to legitimize the king's power.
Technology as a tool of the state.
And it wasn't just metal. The Steppe Highway brought biology too. Wheat.
Wheat. I always associate ancient China with rice and millet. That's what I learned in school.
And that's correct. Rice in the south, millet in the north. That was the native agricultural package. But wheat is originally from the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. It traveled across the steppe, horse by horse, camp by camp, and arrived in China via these nomadic interactions, along with sheep and goats.
So the classic northern Chinese diet noodles, dumplings, lambs, that's not native in the strictest sense. That's a fusion cuisine born from this collision.
It's a technological transfer, plain and simple. And think about the impact. Wheat allows for different harvest cycles than millet. It grows in different conditions. Sheep and goats allow you to use scrubland that you can't farm for crops. This influx of nomadic tech metal, crops, animals, supercharged the Chinese population and agricultural base.
It just completely validates the idea that isolation is a myth. The Middle Kingdom wasn't built in a vacuum. It was built by absorbing the best tools from the so-called barbarians and using them to build a stronger state.
And that stronger state was absolutely necessary, because while the nomads brought wheat and bronze, they also brought war, constant existential war. Which leads us directly to the third mechanism, the one that explains the map.
Why China is one big blob and Europe is a jigsaw puzzle.
The geopolitics of survival.
There's a narrative I've been following about the Great Wall mindset, but not the physical wall, the psychological one. Picture a family in the late Neolithic period living in this constant state of collective survival. To their north, the climate is shifting, making the nomads more desperate and mobile. To their south, the floods are unpredictable. In this world, the individual is a luxury that leads to extinction. I read a piece about how these communities prioritized the long term over the now, building granaries that could last through years of siege or drought. Now, I'll be honest, when I read these stories of extreme collective discipline, it can feel a bit intense, especially compared to our modern focus on personal liberty. From a Western perspective, we might see this as a loss of the self. But when I look at the volatility of the modern world, I try to empathize with that ancient farmer's fear. To him, state capacity wasn't a political theory. It was the only thing standing between his children and a famine. It's a perspective that prioritizes the survival of the civilization as a single organism, and while it's a heavy weight to carry, you have to respect the sheer endurance it has bought them over 5,000 years.
That tension you just described, the loss of self versus collective survival calculation, that is the heart of the matter. And to understand why that calculation is so profoundly different in China compared to the West, we have to look at the work of these economists, Ko, Koyama, and Tsang. They developed a model based on what they call the geography of fear.
The geography of fear. Okay, let's visualize the map. I'm looking at China.
Look at the borders. To the east, what do you have?
The Pacific Ocean.
Right. Until very modern times, that's a wall. Nobody's invading from the middle of the Pacific.
Huh.
To the south, you have dense, malaria-ridden jungles and high mountains. Very difficult to move a large army through.
Okay.
To the west, you have the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas. The roots of the world, another massive barrier.
So you have a back wall. You're relatively safe on three sides.
Yes. But then you look north. The north is wide open. It's the steppe, a flat, grassy superhighway that stretches all the way to Hungary. And for nomads on horseback, that's not a barrier. That's an invitation.
And they have what the sources call an indefinite margin of retreat.
What does that mean? It means the nomads can attack you. And if you fight back and start to win, they can just ride away into the endless grass where your infantry-based farming army can't follow. They live to fight another day. But you, the farmer, you can't run. Your wealth, your survival is the land. You're a sitting duck.
This creates what you called a unidirectional threat. For thousands of years, the existential danger to China came from one direction and one direction only: the north.
The Xiongnu, the Mongols, the Jurchen, the Manchus. It was a constant, singular, overwhelming pressure.
Okay, now let's contrast that with Europe. Why didn't Europe unify against a threat?
Because Europe had multi-directional threats.
Exactly.
Imagine you are the king of France in the 9th century. You aren't just worried about one border. You have Vikings raiding your northern coast from the sea. You have Muslim armies coming up from Spain in the south. You have Magyar horsemen raiding from the east, from Hungary. You have the English across the channel. The threat is omnidirectional. It's coming from everywhere.
And the geography is completely different too. Europe is chopped up.
It's a peninsula of peninsulas. You have the Alps cutting off Italy, the Pyrenees cutting off Spain, the English Channel, large, dense forests in Germany. It's a naturally fractured landscape.
So in that kind of environment, does a giant centralized empire even make sense?
No, it's actually counterproductive. If you are a peasant in the Rhineland and Vikings are sailing up the river to burn your village, you can't wait for an emperor in distant Rome or Paris to maybe send a legion. By the time they arrive, you're already dead.
You need a local solution. You need a guy in a castle on the hill right now.
You need feudalism. You need decentralization. The geography and the threat profile favor fragmentation into smaller, more defensible states.
But in China, the opposite is true. Because the threat from the north is so massive and comes across such a wide, open front, a small state is useless. A local warlord cannot build a great wall.
He can't.
A local warlord cannot raise a standing army of 200,000 infantry to hold the line against a Mongol horde.
It's impossible. You need scale. You need to mobilize the resources of the entire agricultural basin from all the millions of farmers to defend that one northern border. It creates a centripetal force.
Yeah.
The fear of the north pushes the civilization inward. It forces it to stick together.
So the conclusion from Ko and Koyama is that this is why China unifies. It's not a cultural preference for being big, it's a strategic necessity. Division equals death. If you split up, the nomads just pick you off one by one.
That's the core of the argument.
This really clarifies the capital city strategy, too. I've always wondered why Beijing is the capital. It's so far north, it's dry, it's dusty, it can be brutally cold. Economically, the center of gravity has always been the Yangtze, Delta, Shanghai, Nanjing. That's where the food and the money are. Why would you put the capital on the front line?
It's a principle that the Ming Dynasty called the emperor guards the gate. In a system where survival is dictated by the northern threat, the political center must be near the military front.
Because if the emperor lived down in the nice, warm, comfortable south,
Two things would happen. Either the generals in the north would become too powerful and decide they should be emperor, and you'd have a civil war. Or they would feel neglected and abandoned, the defense would rot, and the nomads would break through and conquer everybody.
So by placing the capital in Beijing, right under the nose of the steppe, you ensure that the entire focus, the entire resources of the empire are funneled to that defense.
That's why the Grand Canal was built. It wasn't a commercial project. It was a military logistical project designed to ship grain from the fertile south up to the hungry armies and bureaucrats in the military north. The whole country is a logistical machine designed to support the northern front.
But there's a downside to this, a trade-off. You said this unity equilibrium creates stability, but it also creates fragility. So,
Well, think back to fragmented Europe. Because it's fragmented, it's robust in a way. If Poland falls to the Mongols, France is fine. If Rome is sacked by barbarians, Constantinople keeps the flame alive in the east. It's compartmentalized.
one part can fail without the whole system crashing.
But in China, because everything is so tightly integrated, because everything is wired to the center,
The center fails.
the whole thing crashes. The levees break because the bureaucracy collapses. The army disintegrates. The grain shipments stop. That's why Chinese history is characterized by these very long periods of massive stability and population growth, punctuated by moments of absolute catastrophic collapse where tens of millions of people die.
Which brings to mind the famous opening of the great novel romance of the Three Kingdoms. The empire, long divided, must unite, long united, must divide.
It's not just poetry, it's a geographic law. The pressure of the steppe forces unity. The unity creates the hydraulic bureaucracy and allows for a massive population. But eventually, the cost of maintaining the system becomes too high, or a bad emperor takes the throne and it snaps, it shatters. But because the geography hasn't changed, the river is still there, the steppe is still there, the pieces inevitably, after a period of chaos, rush back together to rebuild the machine. It's a cycle.
So let's try to synthesize this. Let's bring the three stories together. We have the chemical reaction you mentioned at the start.
Right. Think of it as a formula with three core components.
Component one, the agriculture, the body.
That's the Yellow River and Yangtze basins, the mud. This provided the calories, the sheer population density, and the hydraulic necessity created the software, the bureaucracy, the ability to mobilize mass labor, the cultural instinct for the collective over the individual.
Component two, the steppe, the tool.
This is the Steppe Highway. The Nomads provided the high-tech inputs, the bronze metallurgy, the chariots, later the cavalry, but also the wheat and sheep. They were the great accelerators of the civilization's capability.
And component three, the threat, the pressure.
That's the geography of fear. The constant existential threat from the north that took that massive population and that high technology and hammered it over centuries into a single unified weapon, the empire.
Miyamoto's conclusion then is that you cannot separate the civilization from the barbarian. It's a false dichotomy.
They're co-creators. They're two halves of the same system. The Middle Kingdom is defined by its relationship with the devil's country. The nomads weren't just the enemies at the gate. In very real sense, they were the architects of the house.
And this model even explains the neighbors, like Korea and Japan.
Miyamoto calls them secondary agricultural societies. They got the package, the rice agriculture, the bronze technology, the writing system, but they got it after it had already been synthesized and refined in China. They didn't have that direct, existential, centuries-long collision with the steppe in the same way.
So the pressures were different.
Very different. Japan, for example, being an island, stayed fragmented and feudal for much longer. Its political development looks a lot more like Europe's, because it had the ocean as its wall. It didn't have the Huns or the Mongols knocking on the door every winter.
It's a total reframe. We usually look at a map and see China as the static, internal thing, a solid block of color. But what we're really looking at is a dynamic process. A 4,000-year-old machine built to solve a specific set of impossible problems. How to tame a river of mud, how to absorb alien technology, and how to survive an unstoppable enemy.
And that machine is still running. The problems have changed names. You could say climate change instead of river floods, trade wars instead of bronze invasions. But the operating system, that deep institutional DNA, is the same. The instinct to centralize, to unify, and to scale.
It makes you reflect on the concept of the bridge again. We usually think of civilization as something that happens in the safe, fertile centers. But the evidence here suggests that the most critical DNA of a civilization, its technology, its state structure, its very definition of survival, is actually forged on the dangerous, windy edges where different worlds collide. It implies that comfort is the enemy of evolution, and that the barbarian at the gate might actually be the architect of the future.